there's this concept of survival remorse in a sense. Is that something you see within not just you particularly, but the other Afghans who made it out? Do you see that in the community, that sort of survival remorse?
I don't know if I see it that much in the community. No, that's not true. I do see that, and especially for spouses who are separated. Mm-hmm. We had another client who was separated again in the chaos, and they told me that, I just can't sleep at night. Well, so when they're awake, I just pace in the middle of the night back and forth, because I know that I can't call them because I think their phone calls might be monitored. Mm. But at the same time, I just am constantly worried about them.
Welcome to So Where Are You From? I'm your host, Nooshin Bagheri, a first-generation Iranian-American by identity and an immigration attorney by profession. Today we have Ms. Asiyah Sarwari, managing attorney at the International Rescue Committee here in Atlanta. The International Rescue Committee is another nonprofit organization here in Atlanta that provides services to refugees who arrive here in Georgia and need assistance in their resettlement process. However, I asked Asiyah to join us today as a guest to talk more about her personal journey. Asiyah herself came to the U.S. as a refugee from Afghanistan many years ago. She is so kindly joining us today to help share firsthand knowledge on the refugee resettlement process and how that process has shaped her. Thank you for joining us today. So I never want to assume, or I'll ask in case, so where are you from?
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I am originally from Afghanistan, but I became a refugee when I was 5 years old. We're actually 2 years old, and then we spent 3 years in Germany, and then 5 years old when we were finally resettled. And then I grew up ever since 5 until now at 46 in Georgia, except for when I worked in Afghanistan. And actually, that's a lie. Up until I moved back to Georgia in 2017. Before that, I worked in Afghanistan on and off from 2003 until 2017. And then, so I'm from Afghanistan in Stone Mountain, Georgia, or Clarkston, Georgia.
Yeah, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know about that part about you moving back to Afghanistan. That's an interesting. We'll have to delve into that at one point. So I didn't realize how young you were when you left. So do you recall anything? Can you tell us, or even when you go back, can you tell us about life back home in Afghanistan and the conditions of the country at that time?
Yeah, so I don't really have a lot of memories from when we left when I was 2.5. I have one memory where I remember the planes kind of coming down, and that was during the initial takeover by the communists in Afghanistan way back in 1979, 1980. And so I don't know if that was just something I heard, even though I've been told that it actually happened. But yeah, I remember Germany really well since we spent 2 until 5 there. And then when I went back in Afghanistan for the first time in 2003, it was an interesting time. The conditions were, the infrastructure was still torn apart because they had, the decades of civil war. But at that point, it was a really hopeful time. So even though we didn't have regular running water or electricity and that sort of thing, even though we were in the capital, it was a really hopeful time. And it was really interesting to be part of it. And so during that first time in 2003, I worked in Afghanistan as kind of like as a teacher. And I helped do a little bit of the school administration for a school for orphans. Oh, wow. And so we did... Basically, it was kind of like a after-school program, too. The schools had just restarted, but everybody needed tutoring because especially the girls, they had 5 years during the Taliban where the schools were all closed. And so I taught English to the kids and also helped with the admin and tried to raise some funds at the same time, too.
Oh, wow. That's really impressive. So what, at the year that you left, what was the reason that you and your family sought refuge?
So specifically, my family was being persecuted by the communists. So as there, during the various political movements, our family was kind of specifically our clan. So Afghans are kind of almost are set up like Scottish the clans and stuff. So there was the families and the, clans and the tribes. And so my clan was specifically targeted, mostly because so many of them had ties to the West. They'd studied and worked overseas. They'd worked in the government. And also my mother was a teacher. And so, as most of her sisters were, and they, at that point, were not allowing teachers to leave the country. So when the communists did the coup, and killed Daoud Khan, our prime minister at the time, then it just kind of went after anybody who may have been connected to him.
Wow, interesting. So when you guys sought refuge, did you specifically pick Germany, or is that something that you just was the opening door or accepting refugees? How does that work when you seek refuge?
Yeah, so my dad was a basketball player and then a coach. He was actually the first captain of the Afghan national basketball team.
So cool.
And so he coached for a while. And so my mom is the youngest of a very big family. And so when all of my uncles just about had been imprisoned by the communist government, and around that time, my father and my mother had moved in with my grandmother to keep an eye on her because my grandfather had passed away several years ago before that. And a friend of my dad's who was a communist said, like, look, you either need to leave this household or you need to get out of the country. And my father said, well, we're not going to leave this household. And so they made plans for my grandmother to leave. And then there were negotiations for, so at that point, one of his basketball friends said, look, there's we can get you a sports visa. The team is going to India for some sort of exhibition stuff. And so my father, under that route, was able to get a visa for my mother, myself, and him. And so then we were in India for about 8 to 9 months, just basically waiting. And so at that point, the one faction of the communists was taken over by another faction. And so then they let all my uncles out. And by then my grandmother had gone to, I don't know if she'd made it to the US by that time too. I had two aunts who had already immigrated in the 60s with their husbands. But yeah, so we just kind of, India was the first place that took us. We just kind of stayed there. And I remember at that point, not that point, I was still young, but my mother saying that when we heard that the first faction of the communists had been kind of removed from the situation, she said, well, great, we're going to move right back to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And that's when people were like, no, it's still not safe. You can't come. And by then, some of our other relatives had made it to India and others had gone to Pakistan by road. So I think our refugee story, as thankfully, so many of the Afghans at that time who had been taken by the communists had been killed, had been killed, and that had not happened to my family. They'd been imprisoned, and like I have one uncle who was in political prison for 8 years because he had brought some Swiss journalists to show what's actually happening, and he had been captured along with the journalists, but the journalists had been released, and so he didn't get out until the mid 80s. So after that, we just kind of were seeing where could we go, and at that point, Germany was accepting people, and the German government. I think certain people were being accepted, but because we already had family in the US, they were just like, you guys at that point can go over there. So we just ended up in the US in that way.
So what my vision of what a refugee camp looks like, and please correct me, because I do want to clarify, like that point when your family, you pick up and you go to India, like the concept of me getting up to another country, it's like, how do you find where you live, what you eat, the language, like you're just a small family, and how is there someone that receives you on the other end, or how does that work? How do you how do you stay in this third country, this in-between country?
Yeah, and I think that's where that's where the privilege comes in. We were privileged enough to have the resources to be able to stay in India for that period of time. And so we weren't classified as refugees by that point. Mm-hmm. And so there are so many people all over the world that, they're either internally displaced because they have to leave their homes. And so they're going and hiding, or they'll go to a neighboring country, which you see a lot of what's happening now with Afghans is they'll go to Pakistan, they'll go to India, and they are in danger of their lives, but they're not classified as refugees by the UNHCR. And so they're really just hand to mouth trying to figure out how to raise money or they are using whatever money they have. A lot of Afghans lost their life savings because the banks, closed during the Taliban, after the last takeover. So I think it also just is an example of the privilege, just being completely candid that my family had, is that we did have these connections. We were able to leave in this way. And that maybe an Afghan who's out in the countryside or something who doesn't have these types of urban connections are not able to get out. So I think, I don't have the exact numbers, but that's also a really big issue. If you look at the experience of, people in the Northern Triangle and, Central America, they make it to the US, but they're not classified as refugees. And then to get the legal classification of asylum, how difficult it is, and so they are really, they're kind of open to exploitation because they don't have the funds or they don't have the knowledge, and I think that's what I always think about how thankful I am is I was never in a refugee camp. And even when we finally came to the US, I was surrounded by family. I have both parents with me from beginning to end. I was not separated. A lot of our Afghans that were evacuated out of the country, they're separated. Just yesterday, we have a client who was able to get out with his 2 young sons, but he was separated at the airport during the chaos. And so his wife, his son, and 2 daughters are still in Afghanistan. Wow. And he thought that they were on a separate plane. And so once he got here, he just realized, hey, and so we're still working on trying to get reunification for him.
Yeah.
And because Afghans came in as parolee status, which is a temporary status, as a temporary status, they have no permanent way to be here. There's no way for him to formally petition for his wife and children to come here. And he has very, very young children. And he's just like, I don't know what to do. They miss their mother. I miss their mother.
Yeah.
And
scary.
And I just think about within the context of other refugees, I was the lucky one,
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's just my
rant.
Amazing. There are family reunification processes, but they're not moving that quickly, and it's kind of a black hole. We put in the requests, we do advocacy for our clients, but we have successes. But then when I think about him, it's been 2 years. And he's beside himself. He's like, she's a woman by herself in Afghanistan.
Oh my God. And that's pretty much impossible life to have over there.
Yeah.
What's going on currently. So once and again, I guess because you were still very young, but I guess while you were in Germany, you got to age 5 before you're coming to the US. Did you have any, we base the US based on cartoons, Disney when we were kids and all of that stuff. Did you have any image of what the US would be like, or would your parents kind of prep you for the life in the US?
No, I know that they did. I know that I was like, okay, well, we're going to America and I'm not going to speak German anymore. And they were pretty funny because they're like, no, let's keep this language. And I'm like, no, thank you. I'm done. Which is kind of silly, but that's what happened. But yeah, no, I just remember being on the plane and learning English. And that was really difficult. But I think once they had been waiting quite a while to see what would happen. And so I spoke German, went to the pre-K and everything. And so when the stuff happened to get to the US, that when we finally got word, then it happened pretty quickly. But yeah.
As a child, did you ever say, why would we keep moving? Why can't we just go back home?
No, my parents, even when we first arrived in the US, we were quite stable. In that, even when we were just in a work, in a complex, an apartment complex, I had my aunts and uncles, and all my cousins around. So I was just kind of preoccupied with the similar things that other little kids are preoccupied. And so, but as I got older and when I got more information, and as you remember, they're so little information about Afghanistan in the popular media, especially back then. Like all we had was Rambo, and and I just remember always looking for information about Afghanistan, like just in the encyclopedias, doing reports on it. So I really had a desire, need, and I remember always, and I'm sure my parents must have mentioned it, because I remember from a young age saying, like, I'm going to go back to Afghanistan and help my country. But of course, then when I finally moved, they're like, why are you moving back to Afghanistan?
Yeah, that we have to ask.
But I remember all of that. But no, I don't remember asking any questions about, like, why are we here? I just like this, we're here. So, yeah.
The excitement. Okay, that's good. So that kind of made you weren't like fighting the change, and that makes it easier on the parents, I guess, because you feel bad. Some kids are not adaptable to change, such a change like that.
I think I was so young too.
Yeah. So what was the hardest part of adjusting to the U.S.?
Speaking English. Yeah, that was really, really difficult for me. And, had great teachers, but I remember just having moments where I remember thinking, like, I need to communicate and I don't know the word for this. And so I think that also kind of gave me my drive to learn English. But I just remember just being really upset about the situation. I remember one time wanting a brown crayon for my drawing, and they couldn't find any, and I couldn't convey it. And like, I still remember that level of frustration as I had. And the teachers were trying to help, but like, I just didn't know the word for it. So yeah.
So during the hard times, like when you first arrived, did you receive some assistance in your resettlement over here? Like, were you guys coming through a nonprofit organization? Were you able to get some assistance to help you resettle?
Yeah, so I know that we got some assistance. I know that my father had said that he remembers attending like job training seminars, because of course working in a government job is not going to happen in the US. And so I remember him saying, like, I remember we went through training courses and that sort of thing. But a lot of it, it wasn't, now I look at IRC's program, and that's where I work now. And that's where I worked right out of college too, way back in 1999. And, I think about all the programs that we have for our refugee clients now. And I'm just like, this is great, just to be able to, so usually what happens is refugees get a certain amount of help in the first 3 to 6 months. And that's what it was like in 1999. Like we had a few programs, but now we've got a lot more programs where, okay, well, now the person's settled, they've got a job, they've got a place, but hey, they want to get extra training, they want to go back to their original profession. And so now we've got a lot more programs. So we didn't have any of those, but I love seeing it now.
Which one of the current programs now that you see you wish you guys had then that would have helped accelerate your resettlement?
Gosh, they've got youth programs now. They've got youth programs where they help kids get into summer camps. And I only do the immigration side, and it's only been 2 months since I've been working in this role. Last year, I worked with them on a part-time basis with their Afghan asylee outreach. And but just seeing like the youth programs that we also have programs where people want to start their own businesses, if they qualify for that. And then just all the ESL trainings. There's so much stuff. So yeah, all of those things. It's just nice because I remember when I worked in 1999, we did great work, but I just remember thinking, this is a gap. This is something that somebody needs to offer somewhere. That gap between college and remedial training, and so I feel like IRC kind of helps with that a lot more.
Oh, that's good.
And I don't think any of the agencies did that in 99. So, yeah.
So your current position, you're a successful attorney. You also took control of your life and the opportunities that this country had to offer to succeed. But it's more so than just the opportunities being offered. It's the mindset. What was your mindset when you first arrived and that kept you motivated to kind of overcome this situation of the position you were when you first arrived?
Yeah, what I've noticed just in my very limited anecdotal experience is that if a person, not all the time, but if a person, like my parents were educated, in Afghanistan. And so it was just not even a question like, oh, you're graduating from high school, let's go, like there was no question. So even if we didn't know the exact way things work here, it was just really helpful just having that expectation of me, you know? And I think my mom and my dad, but they both just, I remember my mom when we were very young and she didn't speak English that well either. And I remember she took like 2 or 3 buses to get to my school parent teacher conference. And later on I asked her, like, why did you do that? And she goes, they just needed to know that you had a parent that cared. Like they needed to know that we were watching. So I will give all the credit to my parents. And I think this is also kind of funny. I remember her telling one of my teachers when I was in 6th or 7th grade that Asiyah wants extra credit. Please give her more work. And I remember thinking, no, I don't. What are you saying? And she's like, yes, you do. And so I'll say that just that expectation that I'm going to go to school and and so I think that there were challenges in being a refugee, but I also think that I'm very, very lucky of other refugees is because I've had all of this family support.
That's true. Because a lot of, like you say, a lot of people come separated or they come with nobody else. It's really difficult. It's a very lonely process. It's really hard. So right now we know how the Taliban has took recontrol of the country again, and the conditions are getting really bad, especially for women, and become very restrictive. How do you handle seeing that, knowing that now you made it out safe?
It's a nightmare. It's really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's really bad.
Because there's this concept of survival remorse in a sense. And is that something you see within not just you particularly, but the other Afghans who made it out? Do you see that in the community, that sort of survival remorse?
I don't know if I see it that much in the community. No, that's not true. I do see that, and especially for spouses who are separated. We had another client who was separated again in the chaos, and they told me that, I just can't sleep at night. Well, so when they're awake, I just pace in the middle of the night back and forth, because I know that I can't call them because I think their phone calls might be monitored. But at the same time, I just am constantly worried about them. So there's definite survivor guilt, I think. I think coming back to IRC, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons was that at least like, hey, I'm helping people. And
you're giving back what you were blessed with too, taking advantage of the opportunity of being here. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that was also one of the things that drove me to going back to work in Afghanistan was like, okay, I've had all of these privileges. Let me go back and see if I can help in any way. And then when I went back, I liked working there. It was enjoyable. I liked especially at the very start, just I think what the media shows and what actually it's like in Afghanistan is completely different, but there was a lot of young people, and there is a lot of young people who are still advocates. They're still working hard. I work with a nonprofit. I don't know if I'm supposed to say their name, but basically they still do training for Afghan women lawyers on legal skills. That continues to this day. And so there's a lot of people still working really, really hard to make Afghanistan a better place. And so when you see how quickly the country collapsed, the government and everything collapsed, I think people are just looking at that instead of all the just everyday people who've worked hard. There were young women who opened up bowling alleys and, cafes and
wow.
And so I think just that vibrancy and being a part of something more interesting and bigger than yourself is what's missing from the dialogue of when people look at Afghanistan. Like they see the Taliban, but in my opinion, they're just as foreign as I am. Like a lot of the Taliban did not grow up in Afghanistan. And so there are conservative elements who are restrictive of women, just like in the US. But that's not the only picture. There are a lot of people who are doing just interesting work, the artwork, And so it's just really difficult to see how everything collapsed that quickly.
Yeah.
And not to get too political, but, you know, the U.S. government was supplying all of the Air Force, all of those types of things, and didn't help set up our own Air Force in Afghanistan. And so when they pulled out completely in a militarily, what else did you think was going to happen?
Yeah.
You know, like, and so you see all these people like, oh, they gave in. And it's like, well, 66,000 Afghan soldiers died over the last, 10 years? Or maybe 20 years. And so Afghans have done nothing but fight.
Yeah.
And then when you see that there's nobody backing them up, but I'm still proud of being Afghan. I'm proud of being Afghan and American. I'm proud of, you know, growing up in Clarkston, Georgia, where we have the most refugees, and I think in 1 square mile. And that's what it was like when I grew up. And so I know the importance of that diversity, and I feel thankful to be part of it.
So I have to say, when you first said when you went back in the beginning of the conversation, I kind of took a little breath. I'm like, oh my gosh, because yes, you know, and I should have been more aware too, because they perceive Iran. They take like one little corner of the country with everyone wearing their black cloak and thinking that's the whole city, when it's not. Such a vibrant, active, you know, pretty equal country. And so, of course, like with the Taliban, all we see Afghanistan, we just see the burqa and everything else. So my thought process, like, wow, you went back. Was it scary? Like, how was it? And of course, this was the in-between of the Taliban having gone before they came back. How was it when you went there? Like, were your parents concerned of you going back?
They really did help me a lot to go back, which always cracks me up because they're so protective. And then I was like, I'm going back. But my uncle had been setting up medical clinics all throughout all of the years. Like, he would go to pretty dangerous areas and set up medical clinics. And so I had said, I want to go back to Afghanistan as soon as the, you know, Taliban was overthrown. And he was like, let's do it. Let's make that happen. And so, like, my mom got in on it. And there was a program called the International Office of Migration's Return of Qualified Afghans program. And so I signed up for that. They said, you know, you need to find some place where you can work. And I told my uncle and I told my mom if she could help me. And he said, we have this school in Kabul, you can teach. And so I made $50 a month. And I got to stay at our very, very old family apartment, which I appreciate. But yeah, it was wonderful. It was really interesting. It was overwhelming. I had an uncle that was like ourselves, like Afghan American, and he was living there. And so I got to stay with him, and it was just a really good experience. But it was scary only because I had only traveled to Germany by myself before that time. So just visiting, you know, cousins.
You just threw yourself in there in your travels, in your international travels.
Yeah. And my parents hadn't been back, so I didn't know how to dress. Like, I had like a little chiffon scarf, which is what some women wore, and that wasn't this, you know, that wasn't how people wore. And I had like a North Face jacket because someone told me it was going to be super cold, and it was not. So it was an adventure, and I'm thankful to have gone through it. And it was, I mean, there were difficult parts, but it was just really interesting. I loved working with children. Yeah. And I actually didn't want to come back to the U.S., but I had already been accepted to law school, and I deferred it for a year. And my uncle said, you need to go and get your graduate degree. You can come back afterwards. And so when I went to law school, I did some internships back in Afghanistan. Wow. And I worked with the embassy of Afghanistan in Washington, D.C. as an intern. So yeah, it was a good experience.
Do your parents ever want to go back or wish to go back? Did they have this longing?
They did go back, and I think just like me, I don't know. I remember
to
my mom
live back,
saying,
maybe not just visit, but to live back, because that's home.
Not now, of course, but I remember at one point my mother saying, like, well, this would be a perfect place to retire to because it's just so much more community based. Yes. It's more walkable. You know, and she just said, and it's funny because, you know, she's Afghan American too now, but just being in your homeland and just being able to go visit, you know, my grandmother's graves and my grandfather's graves, like those types of things.
That's home. That's home for them.
And when I lived there, I remember saying, like, when you guys retire, you should spend your summers and your spring here, and then the winters in Georgia. Like, I thought that was lovely. So.
No, I don't think they'll ever leave back. Like, my mom has been here for like 50 years, and I always tell this joke that when I was helping her check in to go visit Iran recently, the checkout person was like, okay, so where are you heading? She's like, home. I'm like, Mom, it's like, it's been 50 years, here's home. But that's her longing. Yeah. And I can see her retiring there. That, I think, would be her dream, because you have community. It's comfortable. That's her space. That's where her personality blooms and comes out. It's her comfort zone. The village is there, you know, you're not alone. Yeah. Here is very individualistic. You're alone here. There's really, even though they have our kids, we can only do so much with them, you know, because everyone's so busy. That's exactly what it is. You know, and when I was there during the last years, there were some older people who would come by themselves, and they would love it because people were visiting them. They just have stuff to do, and it's easier to get around, especially in the capital. And of course, there's also more respect for elders, I think, there too. It's, and my entire family's refugees. We don't really have any family in Afghanistan anymore. Oh, so that's amazing that everyone, you know, was able to get out.
I mean, my family, most people were able to get out, but other families, unfortunately, they were killed, you know, by the communists, and everybody else fled because of just how systematic they were being targeted. So,
So as we wrap up, do you have any insight to help shed light and understanding of the experience of being resettled into a new country? Any insight to provide, like, compassion or so of those coming in? Like, what if anyone went to assist the refugees coming in, what would be the best assistance?
Oh, you know, there are lots of volunteer programs, and I think that those are really, really helpful. You know, and I think that helping people, just the very basic things, depending on where the person, it's valuable. That actually, Leah Thompson, who's class of 2000, who's visiting me right now, she and I volunteered with an Iraqi Kurdish refugee family when we were in college. And it's such a great experience to be able to volunteer with somebody, share, you know, our culture and their culture. So I always tell people, if you're interested in working with refugees, you know, of course, there's IRC. We have a great volunteer program, but also look into other resettlement agencies as well. There's so many people who just maybe want friends, especially the ones who've come who weren't lucky enough to come with the entire clan like I did. Yeah. So I always tell people, volunteer. There's so much you can learn.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Asiyah, for sharing your personal journey and story. I'm happy to hear about your family being all safe, and I pray that client of yours gets reunited with his wife. It is really sad and scary times right now, and hopefully can go back to how it was blossoming before the time that you went to go live there. Thank you again. I really appreciate you sharing that. You have a wonderful day, and I hope this brings insight to those, because I do, like, I don't know if you know, I do assist the refugees with annual donation drives, and everyone's always asking how they can help, but definitely will share the IRC resource page to see if anyone wants to volunteer, they know where to go to.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You have a wonderful day. Thank you.